The air was thick with frost the morning they found the boy. It was February 14th, 1847, in the northern English town of Wexley. A narrow cluster of soot-stained buildings nestled between the Coal Hills and a half-frozen river that hadn't run clean in a decade. The sky hung low, as if pressing against the chapel steeples, and a cruel wind slithered through the alleys like something hunting. Mrs. Lorna Whitlock, the laundress for the old charity house, had only just arrived with her cart, wheels crunching over gravel, hands raw and red from winter, when she noticed the back door unlatched. That in itself was strange. The sisters were precise. Locked doors were sacred, but the real unease began when she called out, and no one answered. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by the bluish morning light filtering through the high, narrow windows. A smell hung there. Not rot exactly, but the thick, sour weight of boiled linens, burnt milk, and something older, faintly medicinal, faintly wrong. Then she heard it, a sound like breath, like someone trying not to breathe. She turned the corner, and there he was, barefoot, in a long, stiff nightgown stained at the hem, standing dead still in the hallway near the surgical wing. A boy of perhaps 10, skin pale as wax, lips chapped and bruised. His eyes were fixed on something behind her. She turned, but the corridor was empty. He hadn't spoken, not even when the nurses found them moments later and rushed in screaming. He didn't speak when they tried to dress him, nor when they coaxed warm broth to his lips. He didn't even blink when the local physician, Dr. Alfred Dern, lifted the boy's hand and found something scribbled on his palm in rust-colored ink. He said we could go, but only if we kept breathing. By nightfall, word of the mute survivor had crept through every back room, tavern, and servant corridor in Wexley. Because that child, silent and shivering, was the only living soul found inside St. Ormond's Infirmary for the indigent and incurable, where 150 patients had reportedly been housed until just 2 weeks before. And now the infirmary was empty. No staff, no patients, no records, just silence. St. Ormond's had stood at the edge of the moors since 1796, built on land no farmer ever tilled. Some said the ground was too stony, others muttered of buried ruins. The building was a 3-story stone cube, plain and severe, with windows that looked more like slits. By law, it had been designated a low-priority residence during the typhus years, and no inspector had stepped inside since 1841. The church offered a small stipend, and the town didn't ask too many questions. It was a place for the forgotten, said Constable Edmund Wright that same day, standing in the snow near the rear courtyard, and maybe some things are best left that way. But others disagreed. A few townsfolk remembered sending parcels there. One woman claimed her aunt had been taken in last November after a seizure fit. A young man said his brother was sent for nervous melancholy before Christmas and hadn't written since. There were whispers of a tall doctor with a strange voice, of breathing exercises done at night, of sudden disappearances. But Wexley had always swallowed it sick. This was different. By the second day, 3 constables and a cleric had entered the hospital to investigate. What they found became the talk of the town for the rest of that winter, and in some corners, long after. The infirmary had been vacated in a hurry. Meals sat half-eaten on trays. Water basins had ice forming in them. Bed sheets were turned down, as if waiting for bodies that had simply dissolved. The chapel's candles were burned down to wax nubs, though no one had been there to light them. Not recently. But most disturbing of all were the beds. The main ward contained 47 iron-framed beds. On every single mattress, faint indentations remained, as if someone had just risen from them. Some were still warm. One had the imprint of a hand, but there were no footprints and no sign of struggle. only a silence so deep that even the windows didn't rattle. The mute boy, whom the sisters named Thomas for lack of better, remained at the rectory under the watch of Father Linley. He would not speak, but he ate when offered bread, and once was found tracing circles into the frost on the window pane. Spirals, perfectly measured. Father Linley wrote in his journal that the boy had no signs of physical abuse, no fever, no bruises, only the bruised lips and a kind of stiffness in the joints, as though he'd been forced to lie motionless for days. He also noted that the boy flinched whenever anyone held their breath too long. An investigator from Manchester arrived 4 days later after telegrams to the bishopric were answered with stern interest. Inspector Callum Roche, formerly of the Southern Lunacy Commission, was a skeptical man. He examined the rooms, the kitchens, the tools. He listened to the staff accounts. He read the logbooks until he noticed that all patient entries after December 20th had been removed, torn out cleanly. The last recorded note in the surgery ledger was dated December 19th, 1846. Respiration trials progressing. Many now understand the ritual. We may soon achieve pure volition. It was signed not by the sisters, nor any known medical officer, but by someone listed only as Dr. G. Harrow, a name no one in Wexley recognized. By the end of the week, several townsfolk were pressing to have the building condemned. Others wanted it reopened. The church said little. The constables said less. And the mute boy watched everyone with wide, unblinking eyes. The only words he ever wrote again, etched into the soft wood beneath his cot with a butter knife, were, "They listened for breath. They said it was the soul's anchor, and when the last anchor breaks." The final word was unfinished, scratched out, or bitten off. The news spread like thaw water under old floorboards, slow, seeping, and impossible to contain. By the end of the second week, the name St. Ormond's was spoken in every kitchen and cattle yard in Wexley, though rarely above a whisper. It was no longer just about the mute boy or the vanishing patients. The building itself had shifted in the town's mind. It had become a place where something terrible had happened, and worse, a place where something might still be happening. On Market Street, the butcher swore he'd seen a man in a doctor's coat walking the upper corridor at dawn. At the flour mill, 2 girls refused to pass the infirmary on their delivery route, claiming they heard rhythmic knocking from inside, always in sets of 3. And in the draughty parlor of Mrs. Ellsworth's boarding house, a rumor began that the boy found inside was not a patient at all, but the son of the doctor himself. "It's in the eyes," said Mrs. Ellsworth, pouring dark tea. "I seen that kind of stare once, back in Liverpool during the cholera years. That was a boy who'd watched something. Not suffered it, others disagreed." "He's cursed," muttered old Clem Hodges, the cemetery groundskeeper. "You find a child walking barefoot in a sanatorium where 100 souls are missing and he don't speak. No child survives that. Not rightfully still, most tried not to speak of it at all. Wexley was a town that relied on forgetting. The mines left widows, the river took children, and the sick were sent away with quiet hope and folded linens. If what happened at St. Ormond's was real, then so too was every ignored scream, every letter unanswered, every Sunday donation that kept it running. That weight was too much. But records remained. February 22nd, 1847. A ledger was found in the parish archives by Deacon Willoughby, a quiet man who had not spoken aloud in years, save for the Mass. He brought the book to Father Linley with trembling hands. Bound in green linen, stained with age, the ledger bore the seal of the Charitable Infirmary Registry. Anno Domini, 1835, St. Ormond's Chapel Hospital for the Indigent and Incurable. Inside were the names of every admitted patient between 1835 and 1845. There were 286 entries, each with dates, conditions, and notations about their treatments. The final 5 years, however, bore no recorded outcomes. No recoveries. No deaths. Just a looping initial, H, at the bottom of the final page, written in cramped ink, "Those who breathe suffer, those who cease become free." The doctor has asked us to wait, and so we wait, and so we breathe. Signed, A. Thistle, orderly dated, October 3rd, 1846. That was the same week the bell at St. Ormond's stopped ringing for the noon prayer. March 1st, 1847. Constable Wright and Inspector Roche returned to the infirmary to investigate a newly reported discovery. Sister Agnes's trunk. It had been tucked into a crawl space, behind the vestry fireplace, wrapped in woolen sheets. Within were folded habits, 2 crucifixes, and a set of handwritten journal pages dated sporadically between August 1846 and December 1846. Her entries, though calm and devout, became increasingly erratic. August 17th. We begin again with the soundings. Dr. Harrow insists the breath is a kind of spirit echo, measurable if not yet seen. The girls are frightened. He tells them to trust the rhythm. September 9th. The 3rd trial has left 6 unable to rise. We are to keep them warm, fed, and quiet. He listens through the walls. Says he can hear them singing beneath their lungs. October 22nd. We no longer speak aloud after sundown, only the breath. He believes silence is a form of faith. December 11th. I dreamed of wires in the throat. I do not believe they were dreams. The last page was torn violently down the center. Only one line remained, written in blood. Not ink. There is a price to watching suffering. A price he means us to pay. As fear grew, so did the factions. The parishioners called for the building to be sanctified and sealed. A holy rite was held on March 4th. Father Linley led 6 altar boys in prayer through every corridor, swinging incense censers so thick that the walls disappeared into smoke. But the moment they reached the 3rd floor surgical wing, the incense faltered. The flames dimmed, and one boy fainted. He awoke screaming of a man in a bone mask who counted each child's breath and said he was saving them for later. That boy, aged 12, was taken to Lister House Sanatorium in Manchester. His breath patterns reportedly became erratic by night, followed by complete apnea for minutes at a time. He was last recorded as dormant but alive. The rationalists, led by a local apothecary named Julian Pike, dismissed the entire event as mass fright. He argued for exhumations and surveys, confident they'd find evidence of typhus or laudanum psychosis. But he never got his chance. Pike vanished 3 days later on his walk home. His scarf was found hanging from the St. Ormond's gate. It had 3 symmetrical slashes through the wool, as if cut by surgical blade. Yet perhaps the most unsettling whispers came not from the frightened, but from those who claimed to remember Harrow. Mrs. Penelope Dunstead, 72, swore she'd seen him in 1843 during a plague outbreak in Huddersfield. "He didn't speak with his mouth," she muttered, eyes glassy. "He watched us as if we were frogs in a jar. Said suffering unlocks the self, and then he vanished before the frost lifted." A retired orderly from an asylum in Cheshire remembered a tall man who requested permission to conduct breath isolation trials in 1839. The request was denied. The man never returned, but 7 patients in that ward reportedly stopped speaking entirely that winter. A final fragment came from an archived letter found at Manchester Royal Infirmary, dated July 1842. It read, "To whom it may concern, I write to report the intrusion of a man calling himself Dr. Gideon Harrow. He claimed to be sent by the Diocesan Sanitary Commission. No such post exists. He requested access to our long-term coma patients to conduct suffering retention analysis. We denied him. He left no forwarding address. Dr. H. Belgrave." The stories now had shape, a name, a pattern, and the town began to wonder if what happened in St. Ormond's was not an accident, but an experiment, a slow, methodical study of how long a human could suffer before the soul begged for release. And worse still, what happened when that soul was told, "No, not yet. Breathe. Again, again, again." Outside the infirmary, spring began to thaw the hard ground. Crocuses emerged near the old surgery door, purple and trembling. The mute boy, Thomas, now spoke 2 words when prompted. He said them only once, to Father Linley, while looking at a flickering candle. "He's listening." And then he inhaled, sharply, as if on cue. Long before he was called the Death Doctor, before the name Gideon Harrow became something to whisper behind lace curtains and priestly veils, he was simply the gentleman who walked too quietly. According to a faded employment ledger uncovered in the vestry safe of St. Ormond's, a man by that name was added to the infirmary's rolls in March of 1844, signed in cramped, exacting script. His listed role, respiratory specialist, unlicensed visiting consultant. No credentials, no university seal, just a crimson stamp marked "Clerical discretion authorized." This was unusual, even for Wexley. A respiratory specialist in a place without a functioning chimney. An unlicensed consultant working within church-funded walls. It wasn't medicine, the record suggested. It was obedience. The few who saw him described him consistently. Tall, rail-thin, always dressed in a deep black coat with a high collar, even in summer. His voice, if he used it, was described as measured, low, or distant, like it came from underwater. But what they most remembered were his hands. "They were too clean," said Mary Ann Blythe, a scullery girl then, now 84 and nearly blind. She spoke to a local journalist decades later. Not like a surgeon's, not workman's hands, just wrong. As if they never touched the things they cut. Another witness, Nurse Edwina Prowse, wrote in a letter to her sister in late 1845, "Dr. H. speaks very little. The patients fear him but obey. He conducts breathing sessions at odd hours, sometimes past midnight. He places his hand on their chest and counts. He always counts. I do not know if it helps them, but when he finishes, they lie very still and smile. As if pain is a kind of gift, that smile was later noted in 8 autopsy reports filed at Manchester County Office under the direction of one Dr. Horace Webb. All 8 bodies, former residents of St. Ormond's, died during routine transport to other facilities. All were described as having identical expressions, lips parted, eyes open, pupils contracted. No signs of struggle or injury. Expression fixed in mild euphoria, Dr. Webb noted it in 3 separate margins. Grin of resignation. The identity of Harrow's kin, if any existed, remained a mystery. There were no parish records, no birth registry under that name in the Diocese of Durham or York. No university attendance under Harrow in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Oxford or Cambridge between 1820 and 1845. But one thread remained. An archived letter discovered in the personal effects of retired physician Dr. Samuel Kearns, dated November 1831, written from a private sanatorium in County Cork, Ireland. To Dr. S. Kearns. We have received your referral, but I must advise caution. The young man you sent, Mr. G.H., has not spoken once in the 4 weeks since his arrival. He listens obsessively to the other patients, records their breathing, and has begun drawing diagrams of lungs with symbols we do not recognize. When questioned, he smiles and points to his throat. I fear he believes something sacred lives in the pause between breaths. Dr. A. Mahoney, St. Moira's Convalescent House. The letter was never responded to, and no discharge papers for G.H. exist from St. Moira's. What became clear was this. Harrow did not invent himself in Wexley. He arrived fully formed, with a theory, a method, and a purpose. according to later fragments discovered in the back pages of a book titled Divine Anatomy, The Body as Vessel, held in the Wexley Seminary Library and authored anonymously in 1839, there were theological underpinnings to Harrow's work. One passage, heavily underlined, read, "Each breath is a tether between the soul and the meat. Pain is not punishment, but clarity. The more one suffers, the more purely one resides in the body, and the more aware of what lies just beyond it." Beneath the underlining, in unfamiliar handwriting, perhaps Harrow's own, was scrawled, "To study suffering is to touch God." But perhaps the most chilling clue came from the walls themselves. Inspector Roche returned to the infirmary on March 17, 1847, with 2 laborers and a chisel team to investigate inconsistencies in the plasterwork of the surgical wing. Measurements had revealed that the outer wall was thicker than the inner, by nearly 2 feet. Behind the wall they uncovered a sealed chamber. No door, no air vent, no markings save one, an engraved brass plate bearing the words Labor quieta, vita substituta, work in silence, life replaced. Inside was a simple wooden table with a padded leather top. Restraints lay open, buckled. A long steel tube extended from the headrest down into the floor. Nearby sat a small cabinet filled with dozens of folded papers. Each page was identical. Date of session, subject initials, breath count, duration of exposure, post-session notes. All were signed. H. Many of the post-session notes read the same. Subject ceased resistance at 3340. Pain curve normalized. Clarity achieved, and once, subject wept and thanked the method. Experiment will resume tomorrow. No full names, no locations, no indications that any authority ever monitored the chamber's existence. The air inside smelled faintly of iron and lavender. It was around this time that the townsfolk began visiting Thomas, the mute boy, less and less. He'd grown taller, thinner, and more watchful. He no longer flinched at shadows, but at silence. When the clock tower bell broke for maintenance and missed its hourly chime, he began to cry. Not loudly, just small rhythmic sobs, timed to the breath. And once, during a thunderstorm that knocked out the chapel lanterns, he stood from his bed and whispered, just loud enough for Sister Elna to hear, "He lives in the space between the inhale and the scream." That same week, she left her post and moved to Leeds. She would never speak of Wexley again. As the investigation deepened, one question began to rise through the fog of dread. Was Harrow a scientist, a priest, or something far older wearing their shape? No photographs existed. No fingerprints were taken. No body was found. Only pages. Only breath. Only that same phrase repeated in different hands, etched into different walls, diaries, and underbed wood. Keep breathing. He hasn't finished watching yet. It was on the night of March 27th, 1847, that the first event occurred publicly, uncontrolled, witnessed, and without explanation. The Wexley Parish Hall had gathered for a town memorial. Father Linley had organized it in part as a balm for the growing unease, and in part as a response to mounting pressure from families who had lost loved ones to the St. Ormond's disappearances. A list of 31 confirmed names was read aloud beneath the stained glass cross, and 3 white candles were lit for those whose names were taken with them. Thomas, the mute boy, sat in the front row. He had not spoken again since his whisper about the man between breaths. But that night, as the candles were lit, his eyes widened, not in fear, in recognition. Then, without warning, he stood, faced the congregation, and began to hum. The sound was faint at first, a low, pulsing tone, neither tuneful nor dissonant, more mechanical than musical, rhythmic, deliberate. Those seated closest later compared it to the sound of a bellows pump or an infant's first breaths slowed to unnatural tempo. Several townsfolk stood up in alarm. Mrs. Harland, whose sister had died under Dr. Harrow's care, attempted to silence the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. He screamed. Not words, just noise, raw, primal, but perfectly measured in timing. 3 seconds on, 1 second off. 3 seconds on, 1 second off. Father Linley described it later in his journal. It was not pain. It was instruction. He was reciting a pattern, and we were all forced to listen. Thomas collapsed before the scream could break tempo. He was rushed to the sacristy, where a physician confirmed he had fainted from breath loss. Not oxygen deprivation, but breath withholding. He had stopped breathing between the rhythmic pulses, voluntarily, over and over. He awoke an hour later with blood trailing from his left nostril and 3 numbers carved into his forearm, 3340. Those numbers matched a timestamp found in Harrow's breath session logs. Session 92, subject VH. Ceased resistance at 3340. Pain curve normalized. Clarity achieved. The town began to fracture. Some claimed Thomas had been possessed, that Harrow's evil lingered in the child and was merely awaiting a vessel. Others believed the boy was reliving what he had survived, that each scream or silence was a fragment of some unholy method Harrow had imprinted onto his patients. But if so, why now? Why in public? On April 2nd, 3 townsmen reported a separate phenomenon. They had gone to the infirmary grounds, despite warnings, to retrieve timbers from the back shed. The place had been scheduled for demolition, though the paperwork was delayed in Durham. As they approached the shed, they noted something odd. The door, which had been swollen shut for months, now hung open. Inside, there was a line of stones, perfectly arranged from the threshold to the far wall, each stone spaced at even intervals, each about the size of a closed fist, and in the dirt, drawn with a stick or nail, was a spiral. It measured 3 feet across. At its center, a single breath mask made of copper, crudely formed, with straps blackened by what appeared to be soot or dried blood. One of the men, Jacob Penley, attempted to lift the mask. He convulsed within seconds. Witnesses said he dropped the mask, staggered backward, and began clutching his throat, not choking, but mimicking the act of inhaling forcibly and repeatedly. Like a man drowning above water, he was hospitalized at Manchester Central Infirmary with a diagnosis of respiratory delusion, a term not previously found in medical texts before 1847. He did not recover. His breath eventually normalized, but his body remained rigid, alert, watchful. He was last seen sitting upright in his cot, staring at a wall for hours, mouthing the word "again" with each breath. On April 5th, Sister Elna, who had previously fled Wexley, sent a letter to the parish. It was brief, unsigned, and contained no return address. Inside were 3 sentences. He made us listen to the silence. He said God only speaks when the lungs are empty. Do not let the boy exhale. No one knew what to make of the final line. But Father Linley took it seriously. He returned to Thomas's bedside that night and found the child breathing at a perfect, steady tempo, 12 breaths per minute. Measured, balanced, trance-like. When asked how he was feeling, Thomas only replied, "I hear him when I sleep. He counts. He never stops counting." More records were uncovered, this time not from Wexley but from Brattleford, a village 19 miles north, now half ruined by flood and long forgotten. An archivist named Lydia Corwin, who had been following reports of the Wexley case through the Anglican Examiner, wrote in with a discovery. In the ruins of Brattleford's old almshouse, she'd found fragments of a burned patient registry dated 1838 to 1841. One page listed a visiting medical clergy, again unlicensed. The name, Reverend Gideon H. In the margins of a surviving log, she transcribed the following line. Trial complete. Patience did not expire, but reached equidistant pause. I believe I have seen the shape of suffering. It is breath made eternal. She ended her letter with a warning. If this is the same man, then Wexley was not his first laboratory. He has done this before. He may have never stopped. The final public incident of the month came on April 13th in the Wexley schoolhouse. A child named Elsie Dunham, age 9, daughter of the town's blacksmith, stood up during grammar recitation, walked silently to the wall, and placed both hands flat against it. She then said, 33 minutes, 40 seconds. If you breathe beyond that, he comes. She collapsed before teachers could reach her. She awoke an hour later with no memory of what she'd said. From then on, parents forbade their children from walking past St. Ormond's. The stone building, with its blank windows and strange shadows, began to feel less like a place and more like an echo. Something that remained because it had not been dismissed, because it still had breath in it. Some said it breathed at night. Others said that if you pressed your ear to its bricks, you'd hear the inhalations of every patient Harrow ever watched. But no one went to check. Not anymore. And Thomas, he no longer needed prompting to speak. He simply murmured, over and over, night after night. He told them suffering was a staircase, but it only ever led to more breath. By April 20th, 1847, the town of Wexley no longer spoke about the infirmary. They spoke around it. Phrases became fragmented. Children called it the breath place. Men referred to it only with nods or long glances toward the moor's edge. Women crossed themselves not out of faith, but to mark the moment they passed within view of its stone gables. A subtle collective shift had occurred. The town was not merely avoiding a building. It was avoiding acknowledgement of it, as if recognition might pull something closer. But dread finds its way through silence, especially when it wears a familiar face. On April 22nd, Sarah Gibbons disappeared. She was 17, one of the nurse apprentices who had once delivered linens to St. Ormond's under the old sisters. That morning, she left her home near Flint Lane at precisely 7:10 a.m. Her father confirmed he watched her walk toward the bakery to collect supplies for the rectory. She never arrived. Her satchel was found 3 hours later beside the Black Ditch culvert, less than a mile from the back gate of the infirmary. The leather strap was intact. The contents were undisturbed. Folded neatly inside was a piece of paper, not parchment, but hospital log sheet, marked with St. Ormond's letterhead. The paper had only one line: "Pain anchors the breath." She wished to stay anchored. It was not signed. But beneath the writing, in faint graphite, were 2 sets of breath measurements. Breaths per minute, 10, duration 33:40. The constables searched the area. No footprints, no signs of struggle, and no body. A witness, a traveling chimney sweep passing through, claimed he saw a man in a long black coat standing beside the ditch that morning. Said he was just watching the water, unmoving. When shown a sketch of Harrow, the sweep only said, "Didn't see his face." But it wasn't a stranger. 3 days later, Sarah returned. She was found standing on the threshold of the infirmary's main gate just after dawn. Her clothing was dry despite a heavy rain the night before. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She would not speak. When questioned, she turned slowly toward Inspector Roche and asked, "Do you remember how long you've been breathing?" It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a riddle. It was, somehow, genuine concern. Then she collapsed. Her lungs were clear, her heart steady, but her body refused to respond to external stimuli for 9 days. On the 10th day, she sat upright in bed and whispered, "He doesn't hurt you. He just watches." And watching is worse. Fear mutated into action. On May 1st, a group of 8 men, farmers, tradesmen, and 2 young constables, entered the infirmary at night with oil lanterns and sledgehammers. Their aim was simple: tear it down, brick by brick, before another child disappeared or spoke in that tone. They made it no further than the chapel wing. According to their own account, what turned them back wasn't threat, apparition, or physical resistance, but fatigue, a creeping, suffocating exhaustion that set in within minutes. One by one, they found themselves unable to lift their tools or hold a steady flame. "I'd been in mines with less air," said Robert Gray, the blacksmith. "But this weren't air. It was like the walls were inhaling us. They left the chapel untouched. 2 of them never slept through the night again." A single clue came from the infirmary's upper floor. A stained glass window in the south stairwell had cracked in the night, spontaneously it seemed. The town clerk, who had come to board up broken panes, noticed a piece of folded paper wedged in the stone sill. It was an unfinished letter, its handwriting tight, angular. "To whomever discovers this, the chamber is not for healing. It is for observing the soul under siege. He told me, the soul becomes visible when pain is constant, and breathing is measured. I have watched men thank him with their final breath. I now understand why. There is no light here, only rhythm. He is not curing death, he is training it to wait." The letter was unsigned, but a tiny wax seal remained in one corner, bearing a symbol not found in any English clerical registry: a triangle within a circle, with a cross pierced through the center. It would later be found etched into 2 more locations: the underside of the surgery table, the stone wall beside the orphan dormitory hearth. This symbol came to be known among the townspeople as the Watcher's Mark. On May 6th, Thomas stopped speaking altogether. He had been growing more lucid, even conversational, until one morning he refused to answer even yes or no questions. When the nurse brought in his food, he simply turned his face to the wall and whispered something beneath his breath. It took 2 days for anyone to understand what he was saying. In, hold, out, hold, in, hold, out, hold. A breathing pattern, repeated endlessly. Sister Alvina timed it. 10 seconds per cycle, 36 cycles per hour. She stopped counting after 6 hours. He did not. Father Linley made one final attempt to contact the diocesan office. He requested the immediate closure and exorcism of St. Ormond's, supported by written testimonies, excerpts from patient records, and signed statements from the surviving townsfolk. The request was marked "Received" in Durham on May 9th. It was denied 2 days later. The office cited insufficient canonical evidence of spiritual interference. The final line of the response read, "We advise patience." These things resolve with time. But time, by then, had already begun to slip. On the night of May 12th, 6 people across Wexley reported waking at exactly 3:33 a.m., gasping for breath. They described vivid dreams, not of violence, but of being watched in a dim room. Always the same layout: bed, brass mask, slow ticking sound, and always the same sensation. I couldn't tell if I was breathing, or if something else was doing it for me. The parish clock tower malfunctioned the next morning. It chimed 33 times at 9 a.m. No one could explain it. The gears were intact, the mechanism fine, but the bell rope was frayed, and at its base were scrawled 3 numbers in chalk: 333. The town's final vote to demolish the building passed unanimously on May 14th. The bulldozers were scheduled from Darlington, but the machines never arrived. The driver, Bernard Hockley, was found unconscious in his vehicle on the edge of Wexley. He had veered off the road, miles from St. Ormond's, but left the ignition running, his eyes wide open, lips blue. He was mouthing a single word over and over. Again. When revived, he had no memory of the journey. But one thing was found in the cab's ashtray: a scrap of linen, rolled tightly. Inside, folded with surgical precision, was a hospital tag. Patient number, so 150. Status, breathing duration. Ongoing. The question that hovered over Wexley like a black sheet of fog was no longer what happened at St. Ormonds. It had become, what have we been allowing to happen again and again? On May 17, 1847, that question received its most chilling echo when a sealed wooden chest was unearthed during an unrelated renovation of the Wexley Public House, once the 18th century rectory. Builders had been replacing the sagging floorboards in the back room when one of them noticed hollowness beneath a row of joists. Beneath the boards, a small trapdoor nailed shut from above. Inside, an iron-banded cedar chest, dry as bone, untouched by moisture or rot. The lid bore no lock, but carved into the wood, in a hand clearly not English, was a phrase, expirare docet servitium, to teach exhalation, is service. Inside were 47 folders, each stamped with the crest of a long-defunct institution, the Orphic Society of Pneumatic Observation, established 1752, Zurich. A German archivist brought in from Lancaster College helped with translation. The society, he confirmed, had been one of dozens of Enlightenment-era pseudo-medical fraternities. But this one focused specifically on respiration as a theological medium. They believed that breath was not merely a function of biology, but a veil. Their hypothesis, every exhale was a momentary dissolution of self, where the soul, for a fraction of time, detached from the body. Through precise suffering and breath manipulation, one could open the veil longer and observe what watches from beyond. The documents inside the chest included schematics, crude but detailed sketches of machines, pneumatic vises, rib compressors, slow-release diaphragmatic harnesses, all designed not to kill, but to sustain suffering through calibrated breathing. One page, undated but marked Zurich Trial 6, contained this annotation in German. No blood was drawn, no bone broken, but subject passed into visual ecstasy at 33 minutes, 40 seconds. Recited phrase, he waits in the hush. Next to the note was a circle of names, D. Harrow, M. Staub, A. Ruckstein, B. Harrow. The last B. Harrow had been underlined. Below it, nephew. Promising Inspector Roche took special interest in that annotation. For the first time there was a familial link. Gideon Harrow had not emerged from nowhere. He was born from an inheritance of silence, one that had spread continent to continent through institutions, not cults. A belief system wearing the garments of medicine. The archivist uncovered additional references to Harrow in a Swiss census from 1826, which listed a Benedict Harrow, naturalized as a British subject, living in Schaffhausen. His profession, respiratory theologist. Nothing further was found. But in the same record, a Gideon Harrow, age 9, was noted under dependents. No mother listed. That year, the Orphic Society dissolved following a fire at its Zurich quarters. 12 members died. One was never identified. The fire report, later published in a small philosophical digest, included a bizarre testimony from a witness. They burned, but made no sound. I watched one man hold his breath until the flames took him. He never screamed. Back in Wexley, a second discovery emerged, this time from the bowels of the church itself. In the disused bell tower, behind a crumbling wall of hymnals, a locked cabinet was found. The key was long gone, but the hinges surrendered easily to time and a crowbar. Inside were records of an older St. Ormonds. Long before it became a hospital, the building had been a Franciscan monastery, dating back to the 1600s. It had served as a rest home for clergy suffering from spiritual dissonance and ritual affliction, phrases that, according to historians, were typically used for those who claimed visions, seizures, or auditory phenomena following periods of prolonged isolation or extreme asceticism. One parchment stood out, a confessional scroll dated 1632, authored by Brother Theodoric, who had lived in St. Ormond's final decade as a monastery. He walks between inhalations, the silent one. We offered fasts, and still he lingered. I have seen men breathe themselves into madness trying not to hear his voice. Beneath this, the last line was written in a different hand, older ink. One of us will teach him. The rest will listen. And then came the final turn. The church records confirmed something no one in Wexley had dared consider. St. Ormond's had been closed once before. In 1774, under order of the Bishop of Durham, following a mass incident in which 31 of 34 residents in the monastery infirmary were found catatonic, eyes open, mouths slightly parted, as if caught mid-breath. The cause had been officially listed as tainted well water, but a notation in red ink on the margin of the closure record read, "No further residents are to be housed here unless silence is required. The walls remember. Bishop Hollingsworth." This note had been redacted in later copies of the record. Only the original parchment held the annotation. It was around this time that Thomas, the boy survivor, was found sitting on the church steps at dawn. He had not been missing. He was still under watch. But none of the sisters remembered escorting him outside. He was sitting perfectly still, back straight, hands on his knees. When Father Linley approached, Thomas turned and said something with complete clarity. He's not trying to stop the breath. He's trying to lengthen it. When asked who he meant, Thomas answered simply, "The one watching." From the other side of the hush, he then reached into the pocket of his nightshirt and handed the priest a folded piece of parchment. It was ancient, cracked and brittle. The seal on it matched the watcher's mark. Inside, written in a language no one in Wexley recognized, were 4 lines. The only words that could be translated with certainty were anchor, silence, 33, return. The pieces now connected. The whispers were not superstition. The boy was not a survivor. He was a recording, a vessel marked by a method, and the doctor. He was not seeking immortality or scientific validation. He was studying a doorway, the pause between breaths where the body is held still and the soul hovers uncertainly. Not gone, not alive, just watched. The records found in Zurich, the monastery logs from 1632, the fire that made no screams, the boy who could recite the time of suffering like scripture, the mask, the pulse, the refusal of death. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. This was not just a forgotten case. It was a philosophy. And somewhere, someone still believed in it. On the evening of May 23, 1847, just before the full moon rose over Wexley, the clocks in town stopped. All of them. At once. The blacksmith's workshop clock, the church steeple bell, even the pendulum in Father Linley's rectory office, long immune to draft or delay, froze mid-tick. The time, 3:33 a.m. No wind stirred. No livestock called. And somewhere in the distance, from no discernible direction, someone began humming. That morning, the church received an envelope with no return address. It had been slid under the side door, wrapped in butcher paper and twine. Inside, a torn ledger page, stamped with the St. Ormond's seal, brittle with age but freshly inked. Across the top, in the same precise hand found in Harrow's earlier notes, Session 151. Subject, community observation. Beneath it, a list, breath synchronization, acceptable resistance, low subject group cohesion, deteriorating onset of shared symptomology, verified duration. Ongoing, at the bottom, a final annotation. Commencement complete. Observation continues. No need for further arrivals. They are all here. Wexley's remaining leaders, Father Linley, Inspector Roche, and a representative from the bishopric convened to decide whether to seal or destroy St. Ormond's once and for all. The town's residents, fractured by weeks of terror and hallucination, had largely fled or gone to ground. But something about the date, May 25th, had created a convergence of fear. The final breath log, now partially deciphered, listed that date explicitly. The 151st session requires no restraints, only observation. At 3:33 a.m., May 24th, midnight. The church bell rang once, without rope or wind. From their posts at opposite sides of the town, 2 constables witnessed light from the second-floor windows of St. Ormond's. No one had entered. The building was locked, condemned, and its cellar doors bricked up weeks prior, but from behind those glass panes, long darkened by soot, glowed a dim, pulsing red. One witness described it as a heartbeat in the walls. Inspector Roche, despite weeks of illness and a persistent shortness of breath, returned to the building with a small team of laborers and a borrowed phonograph. The plan: document everything, every sound, every breath. They entered the surgical wing at 2:47 a.m. on May 25th. Inside, they found no one, no bodies, no equipment, only rows of beds, neatly made, each with a nameplate, each bearing the name of a current living Wexley resident, including Father Linley, Inspector Roche, Sarah Gibbons, Thomas. And the entire church choir roster, pinned to each pillar, was a folded page. Each bore a single word: observed. The walls began to breathe, not in metaphor, not by hallucination, but audibly. The men described a faint intake and exhale sound from the plaster itself. The air shifted rhythmically, measured, mechanical, as if the building itself had become a lung. The phonograph needle scratched. Then it spun and began to record a sound that none of the men heard with their ears. A voice, low, distant, reciting 33 and 40, 33 and 40, again. Again, the inspector began coughing, then gasping. 2 men dragged him out. The recording was later transcribed. The breath does not end at the lungs. It leaves the body in waves, measurable, observable. Each soul carries a frequency. At 33:40, the soul hums loudest. We listen, we learn, we wait. What happened after 3:33? AM remains a fracture in Wexley's collective memory. 3 survivors, including the inspector, woke in the vestry hall at dawn with no memory of exiting the infirmary. One of them, a stonemason named Alfred Norrin, was found writing the same word over and over into the dirt with his thumb. Watched. His breath rate was irregular, his pupils non-reactive. He died 4 hours later of cardiac arrest, but not before saying, to no one in particular, he waits until you forget to exhale. Later that week, the demolition crew from Darlington finally arrived. But when they reached Wexley, they found the infirmary gone. Not collapsed, not razed, gone. The land remained. The foundation stone still circled the perimeter, but the building, its windows, its walls, its secrets, had vanished as if lifted from the earth. In its place, silence, and in that silence, a strange echo. Several workmen refused to stay. One of them said he heard breathing through the dirt. Another man, a foreman named Ellis Fry, returned to the site alone a week later. He carved a sign from oak, placed it in the center of the old courtyard, and left it there without permission. It read, "Here, breath was studied. Let no one count again." That sign remained until 1891. It burned mysteriously in a lightning strike. And Thomas, he was gone. Last seen on the church steps at sunset on May 25th. He had said nothing, but someone found a note under his pillow the next morning, folded 4 times, written in charcoal, It read, "He doesn't end lives. He just keeps them long enough to learn. If you feel breathless, he is watching you learn, too." Today, Wexley is no longer on most maps. Its lands were absorbed into nearby estates. The church, rebuilt and rededicated, has no records before 1850, and only one person, an elderly archivist in York, keeps the original breath logs, now brittle with time. She refuses to open them. She simply says, "There are things in history that are not meant to be remembered because they are still occurring." Wexley faded from records the way breath fades from a mirror. Visible only for a moment, then gone, leaving behind the faintest suggestion that something was there. The county almanacs for 1848 list no formal town dissolution. There is no decree of abandonment, no documented outbreak, no legal catastrophe to explain its slow disappearance. And yet by 1852, the name Wexley no longer appeared in Durham postal directories, and the surrounding region was relabeled simply as North Parish Moorland, unsettled. Not uninhabitable, just unsettled. And yet the echoes persist. In 1901, a surveyor named Edmund Brixley contracted to chart forgotten rural boundaries for the Crown's Land Registry, rediscovered the edge of Wexley's former footprint. He found nothing but uneven ground, a patch of soil where no moss grew, and 3 cracked foundation stones partially buried in peat. But it wasn't the terrain that unsettled him. It was the object buried under those stones. A bronze medallion about the size of a coin, heavily tarnished. On one side, the image of lungs encircled by a serpent. On the reverse, barely visible, a phrase in Latin, etched in concentric rings. Ut anima manet, respira in tenebris, observatur. While the soul remains, breathe in the dark. You are being watched. Brixley, not knowing the symbol's origin, mailed it to the British Museum. The parcel was returned to sender 2 weeks later, marked in red wax, unclassified, hold, returned at request of clerical authority. He never received an explanation. In 1924, a Jesuit archivist conducting research on suppressed religious orders found a misplaced ledger in the Vatican's private library. It was labeled Ordo Noma Obscura, Brevis Sedatio, the Order of the Dark Breath, brief respite. Most pages were censored, but one remained. The breath is the soul's rhythm. To still it is death. To stretch it is revelation. The watcher does not give pain. He witnesses it, and in witnessing, extends it, and in extension, learns, and in learning, becomes us. The final paragraph listed sites of known extended observation. Wexley was third on the list, after Brattleford, England, 1774, and Zurich, Switzerland, 1826. No fourth site was listed, but the bottom of the page bore a faint pencil annotation. The fourth is chosen. It does not yet know the breathing logs of St. Ormond's were quietly acquired by a private collector in 1939. They were catalogued not as medical records, but as spiritual mnemonics. Their current whereabouts are unknown, though fragments were scanned by the Oxford Library in 1996 for a project on early psychological experimentation. One fragment, a session report labeled Number 151, Observation Complete, contains a strange notation. Final subjects retained. Community cohesion failed. Integration successful. Next selection to occur upon breach in exhale cycle memory. Monitoring continues, but the most disturbing evidence of the aftermath came not from church records or state archives, but from a child's diary. In 1953, during a home renovation in Newcastle, a family uncovered a cloth-wrapped book tucked into a heating duct. The house had once belonged to a widowed governess from Durham, her name long forgotten. The diary belonged to her daughter, Elsie, age 11. The entries begin innocently, musings about school, friends, and a strange dream. Then, on September the 3rd, she writes, "Last night I dreamed I was lying in a room with a mask on. There was a man behind glass. He didn't speak. He just watched. I couldn't tell if I was asleep or holding my breath a week later. I woke up gasping. Mummy says I stopped breathing, but I remember counting. 33, 40. Her final entry, I think he likes when we keep breathing, not for health." For time, the diary ends abruptly. There is no record of Elsie after that winter. To this day, no known grave exists for Dr. Gideon Harrow. His name appears only in scattered logs, unsigned reports, and witness statements. But in 2016, a forensic anthropologist studying abandoned sites in the Northumberland region uncovered a partial set of skeletal remains buried beneath an ancient drainage channel, 30 miles from Wexley's last known location. The body was missing its skull. Its ribcage had been carefully opened and held in place with wire loops, as if the lungs had once been removed, studied, then reinserted. There was no clothing, no jewelry, only a small rusted object placed inside the chest cavity, a brass breath counter, a device used in Victorian hospitals to measure the duration between breaths in post-traumatic patients. It had stopped at 33 minutes, 40 seconds. The silence that followed Wexley's disappearance is not empty. It rings, through time, through records, through stories whispered from nurse to apprentice, through diaries never finished, through buildings torn down but never quite forgotten. Even now, some say, if you stand in the stillness before dawn, when your lungs feel too heavy and the night presses in just enough, you might feel something watching, not malicious, not angry, just curious, waiting, learning, counting, and if you listen carefully, between your own inhale and the moment you forget to exhale, you may just hear it, faint and rhythmic, again, again. History is not only made of wars and victories, it is also composed of forgotten corridors, misfiled names, and breaths no longer remembered. Wexley was not just a town, it was a method, and methods do not die. They adapt, they observe, and sometimes they wait. Thank you for walking with us through the dark. For more forgotten horrors, historical truths, and the stories that were never meant to be told. Subscribe for deeper journeys into history's darkest corners.